Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeremy Smith. I'll be filling in for Sarah Jackal today, who wasn't able to make it, and I'll be moderating today's panel. I'm the CEO of Civitech, a public benefit corporation based out of Austin, Texas, that provides an affordable and accessible suite of tools to register and turn out voters, recruit candidates to run for office, and help Democratic and progressive candidates win their elections. I'm very honored to be here leading this panel with you all today. In the aftermath of Election Day 2020, Republican lawmakers coordinated at the federal, state, and local level to undermine the results of the presidential election. Secretaries of state, local election officials, and organizers on the ground became political targets in an effort to not only change the outcome of the 2020 election, but to change the outcomes of future elections. Since then, Republicans, especially in red states, have passed even greater restrictions on the ability to vote and have your vote counted in what appears to be nothing more than a transparent attempt to remain in power. They are closing polling locations, shortening the window for early voting, and eliminating drop-box locations. These policies acutely target black and brown communities so that their votes won't be counted in upcoming midterm elections. Voter suppression is not new, but it feels like in this day and age, it should not be so brazen, yet it is. We actually have Republican lawmakers making it illegal to give food to someone standing in a long line waiting to vote. We were all dealt a pretty sobering blow when the Senate failed to pass the national voting rights legislation like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act earlier this year. It's been nearly 30 years since the last meaningful update to voting rights legislation. The NVRA was passed in 1993. Without federal action, where do we go from here? Where do we find hope? We organize. We want to beat these voter suppression laws by wielding the power of people and communities against them. Our panelists today are working on many fronts across the country to organize their communities, fight voter suppression, and expand the electorate. I'm very honored to get to be here and introduce all of them so you can have a conversation directly with the experts. With that, I'd like to introduce first Stephanie Gomez from Move, Texas, where she is the political director. She works to mobilize, organize, vote, and empower underrepresented youth communities through civic education, leadership development, and issue advocacy. She's a Houston native who has dedicated her career to getting people excited about reforming democracy in Texas. While a student at the University of Houston, she regularly chased her peers down through the halls to make sure they were registered to vote. From knocking doors on the Wendy Davis gubernatorial campaign in 2014 to leading a statewide voting rights legislative coalition as the Associate Director for Common Cause Texas, Stephanie has been using her unbridled enthusiasm to serve the interests of Texans. Thank you for joining us here today, Stephanie. At the end, we have Charlie Olena, who is the Senior Advocacy Director for Secure Democracy USA. In this role, Charlie manages Secure Democracy's full advocacy team working across 20 state legislatures, identifying policy and advocacy trends and coordinating responses with state and national partners, in addition to managing work directly in 6 states. Charlie works to bring together legislative leadership, election administrators, and advocates to pass election reform that strengthens the security and integrity of our elections while protecting and expanding access to the ballot. Prior to joining the team at Secure Democracy, Charlie led state and local advocacy work in Colorado on a host of issues, and Charlie's work has been featured frequently by the press, including Politico, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and numerous state media outlets. Thank you, Charlie, for joining us here today. Last but not least, we have Secretary Jena Griswold, who is the Secretary of State in Colorado. In 2018, she was elected as the first Democratic Secretary of State in Colorado in 60 years, making her the first Democratic woman Secretary of State in Colorado's history and the current youngest statewide elected official in Colorado. In 2020, Jena successfully oversaw the largest general election in Colorado state history, with 94% of voters casting their ballot using the mail or a ballot drop box. Before her election, Secretary Griswold built a successful career as an attorney. She received her JD from Penn, started her legal career practicing international anti-corruption law, and then began working on our elections as a voter protection attorney for President Obama. And we are deeply honored to have her here with us today. So I'd like to jump right into some questions. A note for the audience, we will move to Q&A. So there are note cards on your chairs if you would prefer to write a question, but we also have a microphone if you'd like to stand up and ask. So we'll move to Q&A in about a half hour. So if you want to write questions now, there will be someone who will come around and pick them up. or you can, I'll let you know and you can stand up and ask your question directly. But we want to make this as involved as possible. So to kick things off with a little bit of a discussion, in the aftermath of the 2020 presidential election, election officials in Secretary of State's offices and local election offices across the country found themselves acting as the last line of defense against an onslaught of efforts, political and legal, by a sitting president to overturn the will of voters. Perhaps not surprisingly, following these showdowns, Republican state legislators in several states have sought to enact laws that allow state lawmakers to seize control of the election process over and above the existing officials. As Stacey Abrams put it, Republicans are brazenly trying to seize local and state election authority in an unprecedented power grab. Had their grand plan been law in 2020, the numerous attempts by state legislatures to overturn the will of the voters would have succeeded. Charlie, are there states where you've seen particularly aggressive laws enacted that would be used by state or local election officials to overturn the will of the voters? What and where should we be looking after votes are cast on November 8th?
Yeah, so unfortunately, this is not an isolated trend, as you may imagine, and we are seeing these conversations and efforts happening in states all across the country. This is not a unique challenge to any particular state or region. And this year alone, we've seen 21 states that have enacted laws to manipulate the administration of our elections for partisan gain. A lot of these policies amount to something like death by 1,000 cuts, and include policies to directly change authority over election administration and increasing legislative authority over certification, new and increased criminal penalties for election administrators, poll workers, and voters, even for innocent and honest mistakes, and then increasing restrictions on funding and resources, as well as the ability of elections administrators to coordinate or speak to or work with nonprofits and organizers in the community. And even beyond those, we're also, to your point, Jeremy, seeing in 18 states this year enacted legislation to restrict voter access overall. And that includes racist proof of citizenship legislation, ill-defined investigations, attacks on drop boxes, vote by mail, early voting, automatic voter registration, new burdensome ID requirements, and as well, I don't think we can underestimate the suppressive power of election mis and disinformation as well. But this is hope in the dark, so it is not all bad news, and I want to share the good news here, which is that even in some of our most difficult states like Arizona, where they introduced 134 bills this session alone touching elections, our coalition was able to defeat over 120 of those bills and also pass some actually affirmatively good policy there, even in that difficult landscape. And nationally, we've seen 24 states pass laws that we consider to be expansions and improvements to election administration. This includes improved access to vote by mail and early voting, more resources for elections administrators who are chronically underfunded, as well as policies that balance the need for security in our elections with access. So policies like cure processes, comprehensive ballot tracking, e-poll books, pre-processing of ballots, risk-limiting audits, even automatic voter registration can meet those dual goals. And in Kentucky, you may be familiar with their national representation, in Kentucky, where they have a super-duper Republican majority in their legislature, we were able to establish early voting for the first time ever, establish drop boxes, a cure process, and an absentee online request form, almost unanimously through their legislature. So it is possible for us to fight back, and it is happening in the states.
That's some great successes, and I think it's a great point to showcase that this, even though we're facing these threats, that there are people who are actually taking work and helping to improve it, and that's what we want to kind of talk about here today with all of you. But to this kind of point and distinction, Secretary Griswold, are these actions by state legislatures the top threat to free and fair elections, or are you seeing other measures that have more of an impact?
Well, thank you, Jeremy. So glad to be on with Charlie and Stephanie. Charlie, great work. I've never heard a legislature described as a super duper Republican majority. Yeah, so obviously we're seeing these voter suppression bills, and they are very meaningful. Last year, 33 voter suppression bills were passed in 19 states to strip Americans of the freedom to vote. But when we think about the attack on democracy, I think we can think about it in three tranches. Number one, make it harder for people to vote. Sometimes that voter suppression is very pointed, like in Georgia, making the lines that were already 11 hours long for predominantly black voters in Atlanta even longer, criminalizing handing an 80-year-old woman standing in one of those lines a glass of water, cutting Sunday voting that directly affects black voters. And some of it's really broad, like what we've seen in Texas. It's so broad, it just ends up disenfranchising Republicans, Democrats, and unaffiliated. So number one is strip Americans of the freedom to vote. Number two is destabilize elections. And how you destabilize elections is through the use of the big lie, which leads to threats towards election workers. Across the nation, 1/6 of election workers have been directly threatened. 1/3 say they're afraid to do their job, and people are quitting. Pennsylvania has already lost over 30% of its Republican and Democratic election workers since 2020. Then you have MAGA extremists like Steve Bannon recruiting into these positions with election deniers. In Colorado, we have a county working behind bulletproof glass. So scare the bejesus out of election workers, get them to stop. And then the big lie sometimes is being adopted by election officials. They embrace it and compromise their own voting systems, trying to prove conspiracies. So destabilize election administration. Number three is lie so much that Americans no longer have that high degree of confidence in elections. And the point of all this, stripping Americans of the freedom to vote, destabilizing elections, lying so there's not confidence, is very clearly to set the table for the next potential stealing of an election. In 2020, we saw President Trump try to steal a presidency. He failed. Now they're focused on 2024 and future elections. So I think it's code red for American democracy right now, and hearing from Charlie and of course Stephanie and Jeremy, which we will hear, is the hope to give us the just passion to keep on fighting, because I do believe that we're going to win this fight for democracy long term. But thanks, Jeremy, for giving me the sad question.
Teeing it up in order. I think, so Secretary Griswold makes a point about all these different types of categories of efforts with intentional purpose. Stephanie, in Texas, that state has long been an incubator for many of these types of ideas. And we see organizations that bring model legislation to places like Texas and trial run certain things. Are there some examples of laws that you've seen aimed at controlling the election process in Texas?
Hi, thank you so much for that question. It's about to get a little more depressing, but I'm glad to be here with y'all because the answer is yes, absolutely. It is something that plagues my day-to-day existence. Very hard for me as a Texan who loves democracy, works with young people who love democracy, and having to have those hard conversations with them where it's like, yes, we're so excited to get you to vote, but also these are really real changes to election law that you have to take into account now. And so, anti-voter legislators are all over Texas, unfortunately. And I think probably the best example that people know about Texas when it comes to anti-voter legislation is the passing of SB 1 last year that passed. In the second special session, it was an absolutely insane, terrible year for me. But this bill is unique because it outlawed pro-voter policies that were actually implemented by innovative, county officials and local leaders who were trying to respond to a moment. They saw that the need for things like drive-through early voting in Houston, right? They saw things like the need for extended early voting. It was just, what it did was give Houstonians, and particularly Black and brown Houstonians, Houstonians who are shift workers, young Houstonians, an opportunity to safely cast their ballot and to do so early. And we saw absolutely wonderful turnout in 2020, and that's what stressed them out, right? Like, they see our democracy operating in the way that it should, and then what they recognize is that this is something that attacks their ability to hold on to power in a state of Texas, because the reality about Texas right now is that it serves a very minimal part of the population. It does not at all represent the reality of Texas, which is a very diverse, very young state. And so, it was really disheartening to see that legislation become law, and it's really hard to deal with those effects with young Texans and know that there's unfortunately a little bit more on the way. But you know what else is on the way? A lot more organizing from young people in all communities across Texas.
I think that's a great point, and I'd like to dive in on a specific example you outlined that's been sort of incubated and as a restriction in Texas. We've seen vote by mail reach particularly salient levels in the last few years with a global pandemic that restricts people's access to public spaces. And vote by mail surged in usage and opportunity during the 2020 election. But interestingly, vote by mail has long been seen as a Republican advantage, and Republican states have long had no excuse absentee voting with no issues for decades. I'm curious, Charlie, like, from your viewpoint, is there anything more than partisan politics at play, like these laws that are being proposed in Arizona and Georgia, limiting things like drop boxes for ballots or who is eligible to be able to vote by mail?
Yeah, I mean, the motivations here are, I think, pretty clear. Clearly motivated by partisan politics and clearly motivated by race as well. So if we look at Arizona, for example, there was a bill this year designed to ban any excuse me, I'm getting over a bout of COVID and a little stuffy still. So this bill in Arizona was designed to ban unmonitored drop boxes. And in our research, we figured out that the places that those drop boxes are most popular and most important are in indigenous communities and on tribal land. And so, of course, that is where they wanted to target restrictions. We were able to defeat that bill 3 separate times in the legislature this year, and I'll get into a little bit why, but the motivation is obvious. And in Georgia as well, another state that moved to restrict drop boxes aggressively this year. Drop boxes are most popular and common in the 4 metro Atlanta counties that are over 50% voters of color. And so in those 4 counties, in 2020, those 4 counties had 107 drop boxes, and this year they will have 25. So the motivation is obvious, and it's clear, and it is highly partisan. But something to consider with the drop boxes piece, good states can be helpful examples for bad states here. And Colorado is a state that has done a really, really, really great job with drop box availability. And one of the things that Colorado does allows clerks flexibility in citing drop boxes to take advantage of existing infrastructure. So for example, putting a drop box in a grocery store where they have security cameras and often a security guard there, but that's a totally public space that anybody can come in and access. So if these restrictions are coming in your states, or you see these conversations happening, and they're gonna do something about security here, think about the ways to creatively comply and protect access at the same time. And us actually elevating that argument created enough doubt with just a couple of Republicans. That's all we needed in Arizona to be able to defeat this bill 3 times over. They realized there was kind of another path forward here and recognized that the bill language wasn't going to be helpful. So keep that in mind too, creative compliance and ways to protect access, while addressing security if it's gonna happen anyway.
I want to go ahead and put in a lock for the rights to creatively comply for a future documentary. I feel like that's a great idea. So looking at that kind of example with vote by mail, for example, in Texas, where I live, the state has long been famous for restricting who is eligible to vote by mail. And this year, there's been a new bill passed that requires that a voter put their driver's license number, their social security number, or their Texas state ID number on the application that they want to, or on the ballot with which they vote by mail, but it has to match whatever number you first signed up to register to vote with, without an easy way to look that up. And so if I registered to vote 30 years ago, which number am I supposed to use and to put on that? And so we have this mechanical and logistical challenge that resulted in 12% of mail-in ballots being rejected during the Texas primary election, which is tens of thousands of people in the primary and hundreds of thousands potentially in the general. So Stephanie, how are organizers on the ground creatively complying or confronting these restrictions to help people actually cast their ballot in a world in which that is the law?
Yeah, this vote by mail stuff is absolutely nuts. It's really hard to explain to people who are just trying to, do what they've been doing for years, right? Because this is something that is affecting a lot of older people in Texas specifically, and they just don't understand because they're this process doesn't make sense. And I'm yes, you're asking all the right questions. It doesn't make sense. In fact, that's something that we even we're pointing out in the legislative session, saying hey, this is going to confuse people. This is going to attack or disproportionately affect older voters or younger voters who are living on college campuses. It's, a statistic that has always stuck with me is that 1 in 8 voters actually lost their ballots in the primary. And y'all might have heard, but it was actually hard for Willie Nelson to, I think he had to try twice to actually get his ballot approved in that entire process. And it's you're coming after Willie Nelson too? That's insane. But yes, our organizers, the overwhelming need in our community is education and support, right? And that's what a lot of the requests that our organization is actually getting right now. So it's not just students or young people who are already engaged, right? It's a lot of professors. It's a lot of other organizations that are what we need right now is organizations like Move Texas that can take this super complex, really unhinged 99-page bill or whatever it is, and just explain to people this is what you need to know, this is how you need to implement it in your vote plan, and continue to support young people and all Texans as they try to cast their ballot. At Move Texas, right, we focus on building a year-round engagement, right? We don't just come in 3 weeks before GOTV starts. We are having these conversations with people now, right? We're putting together curriculum to support young people who are building communities and also getting that information out to their campuses now, right? And we didn't start today, right? We've been doing that. And so, we're really excited to continue mobilizing against these changes to the election law and whatever threats are coming, because unfortunately we know that they are. And I'm really excited to say that we're doing that by relaunching our campus chapter program. They're actually doing it this today. What is it, Saturday? They're doing it today in San Antonio. I'm really bummed I can't be there, but I'm happy to be here with y'all, where we're putting young organizers through trainings on how to have conversations. What actually does it look like to work for democracy in an anti-democracy state, and really preparing these young people to go back into their communities and just help us do a lot of this community education.
I like this notion that inconveniencing celebrities turns out to be a really powerful organizing element for us. I remember in 2016, I was working the presidential election, and there was this issue with ballot vote by mail designs that they had the postal system address to the voter on one side and the return address on the other side of the same envelope. And so what would happen is, depending on which way it got loaded on the conveyor belt at the Postal Service office, you could mail your ballot back and it would get redelivered to you. And a New York Times reporter got her ballot back like 4 times in a row and wasn't able to vote. And I was like, you should write about that. Like, that would be helpful. But that seems like a uniquely American thing, where if Willie Nelson is inconvenienced, we might have a chance. So, but I want to like look. So we have these examples of incubation. We have these examples of like deliberate attempts to inconvenience and limit access to voting to make it harder. But there's this whole other side of the coin here, which is there's a lot of people who are actually improving this process, and we had one of the most free and fair elections ever in 2020, despite all these things, because of people sitting here like Secretary Griswold. So I'd like to turn to you and talk about what kind of success have you had, and what are you seeing, and is there a path to more universal approach based on the things that you are trialing?
Well, that's a great question. And before I answer that, I want to make it really clear, this inconveniencing is extreme elected officials trying to steal their seats from the American people. Make no mistake, an inconvenience is a political strategy that is so undemocratic, that is so un-American, that these people should have full shame for what they're trying to do. And it's not just the right to vote. And if you can imagine even saying the statement, it's not just the right to vote, the most fundamental of rights that they're stealing from the American people. We know that it's tied into reasonable gun reform, making sure that there's violent background checks on folks so second graders aren't afraid to go to school. We know it's hand in hand with the attack on women, the fact that women are no longer full citizens in this country. And there's legislators so extreme, they would require 10-year-old girls who are raped to give birth. We know it's tied into the ability to safeguard birth control. We know that it's tied in to the impeding, stripping away of protections around marriage equality. This is egregious what these folks are doing, and we should call it out for exactly what it is. With that said, there is hope in that darkness. One of the things that we have to do is elect people who are willing to protect the foundation of this country, who believe that the American people get to decide elections. And frankly, right now, that's Democratic Secretaries of State. I won my election in 2018, the first Democrat elected since Eisenhower was in the White House. I became Colorado's first Democratic woman Secretary of State, the youngest Secretary of State in the country, which I continue to be. And in 2019, I was able to lead and get into law the largest democracy reform package passed in the country. By the way, Charlie was in Colorado, and she helped get that effort through. So absolutely, Charlie's a superstar, national superstar. But we ended up in 2019. I'm not trying to make you blush, Charlie. Just trying to say the truth. But in 2019, we did a series of things. We increased drop boxes. I've increased drop boxes by 65%. We also guaranteed voting access on all tribal lands and public universities. When Arizona and the Supreme Court is stripping away access on voting on tribal lands, we're adding it. We added more voting centers. We passed parolee reenfranchisement. So flip of a switch, 11,000 people reenfranchised. We passed automatic voter registration, which registered 250,000 people in the middle of the pandemic. We also, by the way, did campaign finance reform and lobbyist reform, because our problem absolutely is the suppression of voters. It's also gerrymandering and the rich and the well-connected trying to buy elections through their dark money funding. So that was just in 2019. I subsequently led statewide ballot tracking, text secure, new technology for younger people to fix their signatures. We did a whole host of things, and unfortunately, this legislative session, I had to lead efforts to make it a crime to dox or retaliate against election workers. I passed the nation's first insider threat law. It's now a felony to compromise voting equipment in the state of Colorado or to leak sensitive passwords. We prohibited open carry within 100 feet of a drop box voting center or where they process ballots. And I had to pass legislation so I could get more routine state patrol coverage. So there is a lot of hope. And Democratic Secretaries of State, even in really tough places like Arizona with Katie Hobbs, have passed major reforms, like automatic voter registration in Arizona. In Michigan, Jocelyn Benson sent out an absentee sign-up form for a mail ballot to every registered voter in 2020. That mattered. So we need to really focus on the policy. We also have to focus on electing people who actually want Americans to vote. That is the distinction that we're going to see in 3 months, and we're ground zero right now in Pennsylvania for that.
I appreciate that. I think that's a really great point to highlight these specific examples of all of these opportunities, right? Every single method by which voters are trying to suppress voters is correspondingly a way to increase access. And I think that that's one of the ways we both creatively comply, but also overturn these things because we open the door back up. We're going to go through one more round of questions, but if you've begun writing your questions, if you would hold those note cards up, we'll have someone come around and grab them, and then I'll come to the audience as well for questions through the microphone. So we've talked here about this kind of, some of the things we are seeing, some of the specific examples, and to this point about where are there opportunities to resist like the most pernicious laws? What are the things, Secretary Griswold, that you see having the most dampening effect, but correspondingly changing that, having the most increasing accessibility to voting?
Well, the Colorado election model is the best election model in the country. We have vote by mail for all. You just register. By the way, you register online. You don't have to jump through a million hoops. You register online. You're automatically sent a mail ballot. And then we have weeks of early voting and even same-day voter registration. You can put accessibility hand in hand with security. We're the most accessible state. We're also considered the most secure state because Russia cannot hack a paper ballot. They just can't. When it comes to the over 400 drop boxes we have across the state, we have video cameras on all of them. We do signature verification, but in a way that actually is not focused on stripping voters of their actual ballot. It's for identification, for security. So it goes hand in hand. This nation, if they want high voter turnout, if that's what folks actually want, it's the expansion of vote by mail. And in 2020, if you can believe it, I was the only Democratic Secretary of State in the entire country from a vote by mail for all state. So I instructed my office that we were going to open up access as quickly as possible for Coloradans, but help any state that wanted our help. States like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Iowa, Montana, we were really talking with every state across the country during the pandemic to make sure Americans could have access to the ballot before vaccine. And I'll tell you, as a nation, we were able to expand access to mail ballots, same thing as absentee voting, it's just different words, to over 84% of American voters. That led to record turnout. Record turnout among Democrats, record turnout among Republicans. Colorado, by the way, had the second highest turnout in the country. So if we want people to vote, it's early voting, easy access to mail ballots, same-day voter registration. It's just that easy. But the truth is, they don't want people to vote. Extreme Republicans do not want people to vote. That is their national policy right now. Instead, they're running even election deniers to oversee states' elections. In Nevada, the Republican nominee for Secretary of State says that if he's elected, he wouldn't have certified Joe Biden's duly won election there. In Arizona, the Republican nominee for Secretary of State says that a Republican will never lose again if he's elected. We have election deniers running also in Michigan, in Minnesota, in New Mexico. What we're seeing is an assault on our fundamental freedoms, on democracy. That's why this upcoming election is so important. Democracy is on the ballot, and the only way we save it is Americans organizing and getting out the vote.
I appreciate that point about this national policy in particular. There's a stated intent. There are deliberate efforts. There's coordination between these elements, and it seems very clear that we are not going to get national voting rights legislation in the near term. Senator Sinema has gone on the Senate floor to say that she will not overturn the filibuster for any issue, and even though we have agreement around how we could get it mechanically, we are not able to pass it at this time. And so elements like this, the incubation of good ideas inside of a state laboratory like Colorado that is spreading positively, is a way to counteract these elements. Stephanie, what role do you see organizers playing on the ground to be most effective in either creatively complying or overcoming efforts to restrict access to the ballot in Texas?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the important thing about that is that organizing takes time, right? It takes a lot of time to bring people into this work. It takes a lot of time to, especially with young people who are, you know, dealing with a lot of things, right? I think I think a lot of people think that it's like, oh, young people don't really understand what's going on. They do, right? Like they are living in multiple climate crises, right? And especially in Texas, right? I think y'all said it earlier. Like I went to bed and I woke up and I was like, oh, I have less rights now, which is terrible. And so young people are experiencing that as well. And so understanding that they might feel like a sense of dread and frustration and like it requires time to address that and also to build a culture of empowerment, because we don't have empowerment for young people at all, right? Like they are not often asked for their opinions. They're not often asked for their what it is that they would do, right? They're told, this is how we've been doing it, right? Like this is what we think that you should be investing into. This is what we think that you should be saying. And you know, for them to come across an organization like Move Texas for the first time, then they're like, maybe I've encountered other organizations that aren't necessarily even youth-centered, right? Like Move Texas is a youth-led organization that is going to invest that time. It's going to build those relationships and explain to young people, like, it's hard, yeah. The systems are systeming, right? Like it is, you know, this like white supremacist, suppressive state, right, is operating in a way that is violent, and that is going to take some time. But like, what are the things that we can do today, right? How can we not only get you registered to vote, which is the first step in, you know, in political empowerment, I would say, but also like, what does it look like to hold it down in the Texas state capitol, right there with all the lawyers and the policy wonks? Like, because I can tell you, in this last legislative session, the people who were there with me until 4 a.m. waiting to testify and tell these elected officials, you are not pushing legislation that I want, were the young people of Texas busing in from, you know, 8 hours away just so they can be a part of this movement as well. And I think that is, you know, that's a big role for us. That's how we're going to organize these young people, is like make sure that they have all the tools to remember that these people actually work for you, and that is why we vote. We vote so we can get elected officials who are not these hyper-partisan nuts, people who want to pass common sense legislation. Like if in my lifetime I see online voter registration in Texas, I'm gonna be so excited. Like I'm throwing a party and y'all are all invited that day. But the thing is, it's like being upfront with them. Like this is a 10 to 15 year fight because we're just working against a lot of systems.
I think it's great to point out that expectation management of that this is a sustained effort, and that something like online voter registration in Texas, which exists in 40 other states, and no one accuses Alabama or Tennessee or Kentucky of somehow being like a radical communist state because they have online voter registration, right? It helps everyone be able to use the internet to communicate with their officials. I think, but setting that clear expectation helps, because I think oftentimes elections and campaigns in particular, it's like this exploitative cycle of we need you right now, please do this one thing right now, and then the feeling of not quite getting like a result out of a lot of work. But it takes that sustained effort. Charlie, you're coordinating teams across 20 other states. Are there any approaches you want to highlight, successes that you're seeing in all these other states?
Definitely. So I think the first thing I want to say is just that states are like 10 million% the front line of these fights. This is where it's happening. And I think particularly this year in states like Arizona, states like Texas, this is where you know, the election manipulators and the folks who do not want democracy in America, these are the testing grounds. This is where they are testing out their playbook for 2024 to see how far they can go. But I think every organizer will tell you that it is not just defense. There is you know, going on offense, proactive work, drawing from all sorts of different approaches and strategies, traditions and experiences happening in states all across the country. I'm going to shine on Arizona a little bit more, but I think some of the things that they're doing that are just so powerful. One is that they have a strong infrastructure of democracy organizations working together. But there's also a real deep and true celebration of a multiplicity of approaches to the work. So there is space for the policy experts, the litigators, and the lawyers to be cranking out our bill summaries and strategizing on what lawsuits to file. There are groups with lobbying capacity who are all working together in the legislature and coordinating and sharing intel, divvying up targets to go and have conversations around this. There are organizers recruiting volunteers, spokespeople, and storytellers to be coming to the Capitol, to be going out in their communities, to be speaking in press and sharing their stories about what voting can deliver for their communities and the way that the system is not working for them now. There are artists pulling together rage paint nights, because sometimes we just need to feel how we're feeling. And if we're pissed off, we gotta feel that and express that. All the way to creative stunts. Like this year, our partners organized a carnival at the Capitol because the legislatures were more akin to a circus than a legislative body. They had dogs dressed up as lions and tigers and elephants and popcorn and jugglers. There is room for all kinds of approaches and all kinds of missions and values and individuals to be a part of this movement, and we need that. And there's a true celebration of each other's strengths. What I'm good at is not maybe what Stephanie's good at, or maybe what Jenna's good at. But if we can leverage each other's strengths and constantly reflect to try to improve, that is where we have opportunities. And then, of course, in a state like Arizona, where the legislature is tough, they're looking at alternate forums and avenues to get done what they want to get done, both working with clerks to leverage, their authority and ability to push the envelope within the guidelines of statute and within those bounds. But also taking this fight to the ballot. So there is a mega omnibus bill of all of our hopes and dreams for election reform in Arizona that our partners have been working hard to get qualified for this year. And that's an opportunity to have the policy conversation that we know Arizona voters actually want to have, and separate it from this conspiracy-driven, kind of lunacy that we see in their legislature. So those are some ways that I think are really important to think about, that multiplicity of approaches, and also thinking about, okay, if this isn't working, where else could we go? Where could we get progress or be able to move the needle on this issue so we can keep moving forward and not just be getting dragged back?
I think what I heard there was like more costume parties and circuses would be good. Like
That's the right takeaway, yeah.
Bread and circuses, okay. If you have a question and you'd like to ask it yourself, please feel free to raise your hand, and the AV team will bring you a microphone. I'm going to go to a written question but feel free to raise your hand so they can come to you and get set up. So first question, I worry that the general public is not yet aware of the very real threat all of this poses to democracy. What suggestions do you have for talking to people who might be thinking that issues like inflation and the economy matter more, to get them to understand the danger and to act accordingly?
That's a really good question. And I actually think people really care about both. I grew up very blue collar up in the mountains of rural Colorado in a cabin with an outhouse outside. We grew up on food stamps. I was the first person in my family to go to college. I actually started working the summer after 7th grade, and that really inspired me to go to college, and then, of course, first person to go to law school in Philadelphia. And I think, people should be very concerned about the cost of living and inflation. Some people can't fill up their gas tanks. It was already hard in the United States for people to pay their bills prior to the tightening of the economy. So when people are, having to think about, do I put food on the table or pay my electricity, that's something that elected officials really should be paying attention to, and of course, top of mind for voters. It's also true that minimum wage isn't going to go up. You're not going to have more protections for the middle class. You're not going to have more protections for unions if you don't have the right to vote. And I know that's a philosophical statement, but I do think to tell you guys that people are taking the attacks on voting just to their core. I travel around the state of Colorado on a constant basis. So I'm in big cities and rural parts and conservative places and liberal places. And no matter where I'm at least once a week, someone comes up to me with tears in their eyes. And I think, to share a story, we were at a parade about a month ago, and a woman from northern Colorado came down to Denver to be in the parade and came up to me and told me that she lost her job in 2020. And she's been on food stamps, she just can't find a steady job. And then she started to cry, but not until we started to talk about the right to vote. The American people know what's happening to them. They know that our rights are at risk. They also know inflation is too high and there needs to be more relief for the middle class and for blue-collar people. I think people are very upset at what's happening in this country. I think women are doubly outraged, not upset, outraged at this point. And I think people understand what's at stake. But to be very clear, in 3 months, this country could lose the right to vote. Democracy is on the ballot in states like Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Georgia, in New Mexico, in Arizona, in Nevada, in swing states across this nation. Americans are going to be able to vote to whether they're going to protect democracy or allow people who are telling us already that they're more beholden to Mar-a-Lago than the American people to run elections. Democracy is on the ballot, and like I said before, I am so confident that Americans are going to save it in November. With that said, this is the fight of our lifetimes. We're seeing the well-funded, well-organized dismantling of American democracy before our eyes right now. We have to win in 2022 to be able to continue to fight, but this is the fight of our lifetimes. I also think we're going to win that to make sure this country continues to be a nation of, by, and for the people.
Anyone from the audience?
R.L. Miller from Climate Hawks Vote, and my organization is concerned with people voting for climate action, of course. On the right, I know that whenever I see a county clerk or a Secretary of State person talking about election integrity, I know that that is code for something bad. Is there any shorthand code that is commonly used on our side, free and fair elections?
That's really funny that you say that. So, election integrity means exactly the same thing as election security, but one side starts saying something and then they just start repeating it over and over. And then, they use code words to send these feelings, and suddenly you have the sentiment out there as like, oh, you can't have accessible elections if you have secure elections. The opposite is actually true. You implement vote by mail, your security goes through the roof. And you can implement it in a way that really protects. I think that the basic message of what Americans want, not just Democrats, not just Republicans, not just unaffiliateds, the basic message of what Americans want are elected officials, secretaries of state, county clerks, who will protect the right of every Republican, Democrat, and unaffiliated to vote in free and fair elections, period. We don't need code words for that. We just need to deliver results. And that's what Democratic secretaries of state have been doing. And, secretaries of state, for the most part, are elected. In Pennsylvania, it's the positions appointed by the governor. But in most of the states, it's an elected position. So we run on a ticket. Democratic secretaries of state do not run to help Democrats. They run to help the American people choose who they want to be elected. So our words are safe and secure elections, free and fair elections, every eligible voter should get to cast a ballot. Those are the messages we should be pushing out.
Yeah, for Secretary Griswold, with all the successes you've had in Colorado, how were you able to neutralize Republican opposition to have those things happen?
Do you know what? On every piece of legislation I passed this year, so that's protecting our election infrastructure from insider threats, protecting election workers, getting security protections myself. I also oversee business registry. We cut registering a business down to $1 for new businesses, did business identity theft protections. Every single one of those legislations, except one, had Republican support. There are great Republicans in this country. There are. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Besides the fact that we had Republican support on the majority of the laws I led this year, if you can believe it, the person I ran against in 2018, the Republican incumbent Secretary of State of Colorado, who I defeated in 2018, when I called him to ask for his help to step into a county where the county clerk had compromised her own voting equipment, he said yes. He said yes. The majority of our county clerks in Colorado are Republican. We've had 2 internal security breaches in Colorado by county clerks where I have had to take action. That clerks association and all those clerks were with me. To be very clear, this fight for voting rights isn't a fight against our Republican neighbors. It's not a fight against the person running, for the most part, for local office. It's not. Republicans, Democrats, and unaffiliateds want free and fair elections. They want a fair game. This is a national fight where people around Trump, including Trump, Steve Bannon, Flynn, are running a concerted effort to destabilize elections. So I think it's really important to, number one, reach across the aisle when you can, whether it's through the legislative process or having to address these security breaches. But number two, recognize this unfortunately is the national Republican strategy right now. That doesn't make our neighbors bad, but that means we have to beat Republican Secretary of State candidates.
You mentioned like this kind of specific asymmetry of trying to fight to protect everyone's right to vote, while a very small select few essentially agitate and use things like the word integrity, like to try to imply a value to it, but that's really self-serving, right? It's about them and their ability to take and hold power. That kind of like leads to this. We have a question from the audience about federal legislation. Can it overrule all of these nefarious efforts? Like, is there a one-shot solution? It seems unlikely that we would get it, but is there hope? Stephanie, are we going to get Texas? Like, what's the opportunity there?
It's so funny because I remember in this last legislative session where we were like thinking the For the People Act was going to come to fruition. It was going to be absolutely wonderful for voting rights advocates everywhere. And I remember, Charlie, you might actually know a little more because I think it was introduced in other states. But I remember that, I don't remember what unhinged person introduced this legislation, but it was a bifurcation bill. And it was like... It was like super complicated. I'm not a lawyer, never wanted to be. And I was like listening to all of our legislative allies and lawyers talk about it. And I'm like, so you're telling me what this bill would do is essentially separate elections totally in Texas, where it's like federal elections that would have to happen under like what is dictated by the For the People Act would be done separately, and you would create an entire separate election system to do state and local elections? That's insane. I was like, am I getting that? Like, what? And so I think, unfortunately, like the Texans, some of the Texans in power right now are, I think, willing to do a lot of insane things to try to hold on to that power, but that's fine because, like, we heard about circuses at the Capitol. I think that is very appropriate for Texas. In the same way that they're going to try insane things on their side, like we are, that is, like, to me, more reason why we should be investing in young people and why we should be telling them, like, hey, like, I've been doing this a while now and it's not really working. So we need these new ideas. We need you to think a little outside of the box and we need to get creative with our organizing.
Just to jump in there too, I think, so yes, I think federal legislation is needed. That would help in a lot of states. At the same time, though, I mean, lots of states are preparing for that to come down. And so Arizona this year also had lots of bills addressing federal-only voters and taking cracks at how to reduce their power and ability to participate. And so, yes to federal legislation, but also states are the front line and are going to continue to be the front line here, particularly with new kind of theories coming up like the independent state legislature theory. We can't skip the fight in the states. And federal legislation is not going to stop the fights in the states. We need that, and we need investment there to continue for sure.
Thank you very much. We're going to go ahead and start kind of wrapping up. We're nearing the end of time. So I want to basically turn back to the theme of this talk, like hope in the dark. We have these people who are running, they're, generally speaking, very normal jobs helping execute elections, right? These are people who live amongst all of us in 3,300 counties and tons of local polling locations. It's volunteers, it's all these organizations, it's regular people, and they're Republican, they're Democrat, they're unaffiliated, with a party, they're a third party, whatever. There's a lot of people who are doing good work. And so for me, what I want to call out is just the credit that so many of them are due for running increasingly better elections in America, despite like a whirlwind of nonsense and attacks and vicious behaviors that have been directed their way. And we need to find ways to support those kinds of people, because it cannot be up to them alone to hold the line for the rest of us, and it should not be their due that by being the fairest way to allow people to express their voice, that they should be the recipients of so much hate. And so I want to leave the audience with kind of this notion that the people running these elections, we need to find ways to hold them up and to recognize them and to continue to support them. And I want to, it's no secret that we're in the lots of political turmoil. We have the overturning of Roe v. Wade. We have this like assault on the transgender community as like a targeted minority. And we have just ongoing attacks of all kinds towards different groups of people across the state legislatures. But local organizers have done a tremendous amount of things to funnel money to abortion funds, to support people living in the states where that access is now restricted, and to even defeating a ballot measure in Kansas overwhelmingly. And we also have elected officials who are actually coming up with, they're not merely resisting bad things, they're actively improving a 200-year-old system and making it better all of the time, making it more secure, making it more modern, and dealing with like exponential population growth. So we have a lot to be hopeful about. For the panel, Stephanie, starting with you, voting isn't the only thing we can do right now. It's obviously a big one and it's coming up soon, but where can the people in this audience channel their efforts to have an impact to defend democracy?
Yeah, this is my favorite question, because my answer is always going to be investing in young people. I'm sure you've heard me say it 3 times just in this panel, and I'm gonna keep saying it. So to me, it's interesting because if you believe in our democracy and if you believe that it needs to be reformed so it can live out the promise, how do you do that without engaging young people and putting them at the center? There's no answer to that because you can't, right? You have to, right? Like, who are we building this democracy for? It is for young people. It's for our future, right? I think that's why MOVE focuses on what we do, right? Like, we are building political power in young people so they can take charge of our democracy. And I love that, right? Like, this is a more diverse generation than we've ever had before. They're queer than ever. They're just everything, right? Like, I'm not fulfilled by going into the Texas Capitol and fighting for not just like the right to vote, but like often justifying my actual existence in the state of Texas, right? That is not fun for me, right? You know what's fun and what's energizing is when I come across a young person who is like, oh, voting could fix this issue that I care about, because it's like oftentimes we don't like come across a young person who's like, I think voting is cool. Like, they're young people who are living life and have thoughts and experiences, and they're like, my big issue, they're like, I had an abortion, right? Like, I need to go vote, right, to protect that right. I'm queer. I need to make sure that I am represented by my elected officials and I'm safe in my society. And I think that my call to action for y'all is like, how are you engaging young people in your organizations or in your lives? And the answer cannot be fellowships and internships. It's like, what are we doing to give young people a piece of this movement? And also, like, how are we like working with them to help set the strategy? Because when you do that, it's creative, it's fun, and it's energizing. And I think, try having some convos with young people and like really listen to them and their ideas, and I think you're gonna see such success.
I think Stephanie's onto something there, because we're sitting up here with the youngest Secretary of State who just listed off all these awesome things that they're doing in Colorado and spreading to the rest of the country. But I'm going to save you for last. Charlie, same question. What can the audience channel their efforts to? Like, how do we maintain that hope in the dark?
Great. So I'm going to split this answer into two pieces. First, I'm going to give you the abstract, and then I'm going to give you the actionable. So first, by way of the abstract, organizing runs on hope. The mood in the general public right now is not great. It is pretty dismal, and on elections in particular, about 50% of likely voters have some sort of concerns about their elections. But we do not inspire action by making it feel insurmountable or impossible. If I say, hey, this thing is impossible to do you want to dedicate 10 hours a week to doing it? No, you just said it was impossible. And so we need to be singing out the affirmative and the hopeful. We need to be explaining what voting can deliver for our communities. You know, to the question about being concerned about inflation. Okay. Yeah, how is that connected to our elections and voting? It is connected. This is how voting matters. And so I think we cannot, now is not the time to back into a defensive crouch. We need to be going on offense, and we need to be fighting. And to do that, we need to hold hearts. We need to hold love in our hearts and hope in our hearts, that we can get to where we know we need to go. One of my partners, Alex Gomez, who's the co-executive director of Living United for Change in Arizona, Lucha, said something on a panel that I am obsessed with, which is that organizing is the catalytic converter that turns my rage into love. So think about how to turn your rage into love. Now to think about the actionable. The biggest point I want to make is to expand partnerships and look across the aisle, look for opportunities to find agreement or alignment, even if it's on one teeny tiny narrow thing. I spend most of my time working with Republicans, and I've shared examples of successes that we've had. In Kentucky, their Republican Secretary of State was a huge champion for their massive expansion of voting rights that they did. We passed that bill almost unanimously. There were 4 votes in the entire legislature I didn't get on that. It is possible to find alignment here across the aisle. Thinking about policies like cure process to allow a voter to fix an innocent mistake on their ballot, that both guarantees that voter's vote is counted, that's important for access, but it's also a security touch point for the elections official to say, yeah, this is the actual person who cast this ballot. So trying to think about, okay, in this tough time, and in this time when it is so partisan and really a charged environment, where can we make progress, even if it's a small bite of the apple? And where are the partnerships that aren't a part of this conversation that should be? Business community, veterans and military members, disability rights groups, faith organizations, labor. Expand your partnerships and the kinds of people that you're reaching out to. Once a week, I try to reach out to a partner, as a potential new partner, as a flyer. Like, I have no idea how this call is going to go. And they may say, like, oh my God, you communist, whatever. And it could be a disaster, but I'm going to have the conversation. I'm going to try because, oh my God, what if we agree on something and could work together to get something done that seems impossible. So those are my two pieces, both abstract and actionable.
Thank you, Charlie. Great points. I think the idea of connecting the outcomes, like the efforts, the voting, with the outcomes and the trust that builds, that it's delivering results. We just had a surprisingly historic legislative output in the last few months that is dramatically improving major American industries and the climate bill, reducing inflation, just making good on so many commitments that it took 4 years of organizing and efforts minimum to get, and decades before that to set the stage. But getting people in place to have that legislature, that strength came from 4 years. It also gave us the Secretary of State of Colorado, who has been leading the way, creating opportunities for people to vote all across the country. Secretary Griswold, will you close us out?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Jeremy and Civitech, for hosting this. Charlie and Stephanie, superstars, thank you for what you're doing in the state, in the states, excuse me. So are you guys from Pennsylvania mostly? No? Anybody from Pennsylvania? Well, I know you guys are. So I was going to say, number one, the first thing you can do is help your local county clerk and your Secretary of State. We have the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania, Secretary Chapman, with us today, who's leading Pennsylvania in a really tremendous way. But she can't do it alone. I can't do it alone. They can't do it alone. Saving democracy depends on every single one of us. So number one, get involved with a campaign if you're so interested. We also have Cisco Aguilar in the back, hiding in the back, who's the Democratic nominee for Secretary of State in Nevada. So he has to win. I have to win in Colorado. So I would say adopt a campaign, get involved. If you don't want to work on a campaign, adopt a state. Make sure that there's enough poll watchers. Make sure that voters know how to cast a ballot. Do something this election. We are going to save democracy, but it depends on every single one of us chipping in dollars, chipping in time. That's what it comes to. So you guys, are you ready to save democracy? Yes. Good, 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 good. Well, thank you guys, and thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, everyone, for being with us. I want to use the position as moderator to put a plug in to support these people and their organizations. You've got Move Texas, you've got Secure Democracy USA, and we need to re-elect Secretary Griswold and these awesome candidates and officials who are in the room with us. So please consider supporting them, donating, volunteering. Thank you to our panelists for being here. We are honored to have you, and it is not lost on us that we are here at Netroots in a room full of people who are doing things. So thank you from us to all of you for the work that you are doing. Go check out the new tool showcase.